I actually laugh at this so much, but when it happens, I tend to just ignore it and be frightened. I'm agnostic, and I remember years ago that my friend used tarot cards for reading my future jobs. He said that I would work with kids, kindergarten, that I would work helping seniors, telecare, that I would work on a company that works with military fabrics, and at some point, at a church. When he said that, I laughed like, you have read it way wrongly, my buddy. Me, working at a church? I would burn before I put a single finger there. 2, maybe 3 years have passed, and I'm working not in a normal church, but in the 2 cathedrals of my city, which are famous all around my country. Everything was okay. My job partners are nice. I have a good salary, maybe some little paranormal behavior that we didn't really have to worry about. But due to COVID-19, one of the cathedrals has been closed temporarily. One of us goes there periodically to stay, watch, and wait for the vigilant guard. There are a lot of sounds, whispers, footsteps, light shapes, hard strikes around the place with no logic that scares me a lot. There are big doors that open and close. My boss told me that I had nothing to worry about because we were in a sacred place, so I tended to just ignore it. We also have a basement where the electrical installations are. We don't have to go down there, but sometimes we have. It has white and black tunnels. There are some rooms that were for wine barrels, but the whole of its interior space and the door looks like it was trapped in history. All of the little alcoves were also used for prisoners' cells, since at one point, the ruler of the Inquisition resided there. Everything always feels so heavy down there. The whispers are louder and more often. I always try to not think about it. I usually end up thinking that I'm just suggesting to myself that I'm hearing what I'm hearing, but after watch one day, on the cameras, oh my god. It wasn't really that scary to me, but talking about this to my friend and coworker that works as a guard, he showed me what the camera of the archive room was recording in that moment. Did you play Final Fantasy? If not, don't worry, just search how the souls look like on the game. There were a lot of almost the same kind of flames floating there in the empty and dark room. I was like, what the hell are those? Animas? Man, this isn't serious, bro. This must be a video trick or a filter. He responded with, those things don't hurt. But he suggested to me not to go into that room alone when the sun goes down, and if I have to, knock on the door and apologize for going inside. He said that they would disappear. Of course, he says that even if I go in, I wouldn't see them just through the camera, and that they don't always appear. The scariest thing was that one day I was in the bathroom and I heard someone come in and stand in front of my toilet door. I assumed it was the archivist because he likes that specific toilet, so I said, give me a minute and the toilet is yours, but I suggest you go for a walk. Haha. There was no reply, but someone took a breath very heavily, and a shadow was clearly under the door. George? I asked. Are you all right? Again, there was no reply, and the breath and shadow behind the door continued to stay there. Oh, I get it, Robert, always trying to prank me. How'd you get into the church? Oh, you came with the boss. I started to be scary because the reply was the same. I started to get really scared because the reply was the same, but there was someone clearly behind the door, deeply, heavily breathing. I just knew that whatever I wanted to do, like if he was a thief and I tried to call the police, he would break down the door easily, and down there in that bathroom, there was not really a signal anyway. If something was going to happen, the best thing was to record all of it on my phone. I asked again who was behind the door. No one replied. I took my keys and put them inside my fist, and after I opened the door, I found nobody. Needless to say, I never went back to those toilets. It sounds dumb, but the only thing I can think to do in those moments is to mock them or tell a joke. I can't say that it works, but it feels safe. And let's add that since then, everything in the place is on silent. I don't hear singing, I don't hear laughing, I don't hear whispers anymore. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, No, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind.
Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why.
My father is a policeman. He's a no-nonsense guy who lives very much in the here and now and believes only in what he can see and feel or hear for himself. At the time of this story, he was in the police force for more than 20 years, and I was a teenager. My father worked night shifts, and on a regular basis he would come home early in the morning to have breakfast with us. He would then go to bed, and we would go to school. He was usually in a good mood and would tell us funny or interesting stories from his day or night at work. At this particular morning, he was unusually silent, and he didn't eat either. My mother asked if he felt all right. It took him a while to actually answer, and he said, "I'm not sure what I experienced tonight." He didn't want to say any more in front of us kids, but we prodded him long enough until he told us the following. It had been a quiet night, and he was out with his colleague in a police car. At some point they were informed over the radio that a car chase was going on not far from them, and their assistance was required. They drove off toward the chase, and soon caught up with the suspect's vehicle. The radio had informed them that 2 men were in the front seat of the car. My father's car pulled up almost beside the car so that he managed to get a good look at the inside. He saw the 2 men in the front arguing heatedly with each other. And then he saw another man in the back. He had no hair and was so pale that he almost seemed white. He was dressed in all black. He looked directly at my father, his face almost pressed against the window with very dark eyes, and he grinned widely. My father was deeply unsettled by this person. He seemed to look directly into my father's eyes. My father was so sure of this third person that he informed the other police cars about him. The chase ended with the car crashing into a fence and the suspects fleeing into a field. They were apprehended only minutes later. There were 2 men, not 3. My father asked his colleagues at the scene if they were sure that there hadn't been a third guy. No one else had seen him. "I can't explain it," he said to us. "I saw him clear as day, and he grinned at me like death himself." This took place in 2004-2005 in Germany. To this day, we have no logical explanation for what he really saw and experienced.
There has always been folklore around black crows and their cawing that my mother has always believed in. I've always been in love with anything creepy, so I bought into black crows aesthetically, but never actually believed that they served as an omen for death, as they're commonly known for. That was until I was told this story later in my life. My mother is from Central America and was born and raised there, only moving to the United States around 2000. She's always been superstitious. She would tell me when I was a kid to be careful around crows. Try not to let one fly in my path or disturb one, because they symbolize death and can predict it if someone in your life is about to die. I was just a kid, so again, I never really believed any of that and just promised to follow these rules to please her. It was still hot and sunny out when I was beginning elementary school, and my mother and father were at home painting our back deck as we had just moved into a new house. This was the first house that we lived in since my mother moved from Central America to the States. All of my mother's family were thousands of miles away from her. She was always worried that something would happen to someone in her family while she was gone. My father was on all fours painting the deck, and my mother had come outside to give him a drink when a black crow swooped down right over my father's head. My mother immediately began to panic and cry. Before my father had a chance to ask her what was wrong, the home phone rang. My mother picked up the phone, crying, and burst into Spanish asking, "Is it Dad?" and "What happened?" before she even knew who was on the other side of the call. It was my mother's family calling to tell her that her father had indeed just passed away. I came home that evening and my father explained that my grandfather had passed on, but he didn't tell me of the crow story. When I was a little older, my mother had told me the story and my father confirmed the order of the events. That story is so strange to me, and ever since then I, too, have been wary of crows and their presence in my life. My mother said that she just knew her father had died in that moment. When the phone rang, she knew she was getting the phone call. I find it interesting that the crow flew so low over my father, perhaps directly symbolizing that a father figure in someone's life had passed away. Where I live, around that time of year, a crow should have been nowhere in sight. There had not been any around that day, or for months even. All of it is just a little too bizarre and creeps me out to this day.
When I was a little kid, I was pretty much fearless. I was out catching snakes barehanded before I was even in first grade. I got in lots of fights because I never backed down from older bullies. I once climbed up the outside of a 5-story building when I was in second grade just because I looked at the blocks in the corner and thought, I could probably do that. When I was in 4th grade, I lived in a small little one-horse town in Ohio, population 1,500. It was the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone else, and knows everyone else's business. When I was in the 4th grade, my older sister, by 2.5 years, and I went out trick-or-treating. This is back in the days when you could go out trick-or-treating so long that you would have to come back home and dump your bag out at some point before going back out. Everything was going completely normal, and we were having a great time in spite of the fact that she and I don't really get along that well. We came up to a house and knocked on the door. A woman answered. Before we could even say trick or treat, I was hit with such a wave of absolute terror that I immediately turned and ran away as fast as I could. When I got about a block away, my fear had subsided and I realized that I had left my sister behind. When I turned around, she was running toward me, about 30 paces behind. I was embarrassed to admit that I had been scared to death, and simply tried to pretend like I had run away because she did and passed her because I was much faster. I asked her, "Why did you run away?" She didn't seem to realize that I had run away before her, and looked bewildered and simply said, "I don't know, I was scared for my life." Having her admit her fear allowed me to admit mine as well. I had been in many near-death situations and more than once thought that I was going to die, but I have never in my life felt such absolute, complete terror. Neither of us had any explanation for it. This wasn't some haunted house on the edge of town. It was just a normal house on a normal street. The woman who had answered the door did not say or do anything that could have frightened us. She didn't look scary or threatening in any way. She looked just like any other average housewife that would have been in someone's living room in the town at that time. To my recollection, she did not say or do anything at all. She simply opened the door, and the minute we saw her, we were both filled with complete and utter terror. Again, I have no explanation for this, nor does my sister.
I was with my niece, who's on her high school soccer team and is taking it pretty serious and attempting to get some kind of scholarship out of it. I'm pretty healthy, but don't really work out too much. Something I often do is run and hike. I live in Kentucky, not in a rural part, but there is a state park near my house that's about 6,500 acres, so it's pretty secluded and densely forested. There are some really nice trails that allow you to run for a good chunk and then hike for a bit to split up the long bits of the trail that are flat. She decided to tag along with me today for a quick 3 or 4 mile run. It was raining, but nothing too heavy, kind of a spitting rain. Nothing we couldn't handle. We got up to the peak of this one hill, and it had been about 2 miles or so according to our phones, so we decided to turn back and head back to the car. As we were headed down the steep side of the climb, we were walking pretty slow, making sure that we didn't lose our footing, when out of nowhere there was the coldest chill that came up from behind us once we made it about halfway down. At the time it happened, we both commented on how cold it was on our backs, but didn't make too much out of it and went on with our conversation. In these woods there's some wildlife like small deer and I believe maybe some coyotes, but they tend to stay away from the paths. At least I've only ever heard them in my many years of coming here, never once seen any more than a few footprints. Once we got off of the hillside and hit a stretch of trail that was flatter ground, we began to pick up the pace when a deer darted across the path maybe 10 yards max in front of us, causing us to stop in our tracks. The first deer was then followed by 3 more, and not one of them even so much as looked our way. My niece looked at me puzzled because of the oddity of it. And to me, they were acting as if they were running from something, a predator of some sort. Once they had gone, we started back with our run, and we heard a noise behind us. A loud booming sound of something of substance falling to the ground from some height. When we stopped and turned, we saw nothing. No animal scurrying away like one would expect after a substantial noise in the wilderness. In fact, everything was calm, eerily calm. Just as we looked at each other to ask what the hell that had been, there was yet another cold wind gush through the valley, pushing all the rain off the leaves surrounding us and soaking our sweatshirts. I was starting to freak out inside, but was doing my best to stay calm for my 17-year-old niece. I'm pretty sure she could tell, though, that I was freaked out. I tell her, "Come on, let's get to the car." And we take off again, and there was a man leaned up against a tree on the side of the trail, dressed in a black suit with a white button-up shirt on. His collar was opened, but he had a tie on, sagging like a tired businessman on the way home from a long day. It startled me at first. I was not expecting to see anyone for a few reasons, one being that we were at least a mile away from any parking lot or street, another being that we had never heard or seen him coming, and the stretch of trail that we were on was flat and open for a good half mile. I got over to put myself between the man and my niece as we jogged past him. When we did, I looked him in the eye and gave him a "how you doing" nod as we went along. He was sort of pale. His eyes were very white, but his irises were ice blue. Everything I saw from the quick look that I got close up looked to be clean-cut and proper. I did not notice a speck of mud on him anywhere, and the two of us had it caked on the bottom of our shoes and even on the back of our pants and shirts from kicking it up on us as we ran. We had to get to the top of another hill, smaller than the last, but still quite the hike. Once at the top, I took a quick look behind us, and he had seemed to vanish without a trace. Now, with having the vantage point of the hill, I could see out past the trail and see most of the trail that she and I had just come from, yet he was nowhere in sight. I scanned the sides of the trail, and still nothing. My niece asked me who that guy was and why he was out so deep in the woods wearing a suit. Questions I simply did not have the answers to. We made it back to the car with nothing else out of the ordinary happening to us on the trail. As we got to my car, I pulled the keys from my pocket and unlocked the doors from maybe about 10 feet out. Walking up to the only car in the entire lot, I noticed muddy footprints coming away from my car from the driver's side. Weird, considering I had no mud on my shoes when we got there. But there are trails leading up to the lot, so I figured maybe someone had came through before we got there and I just didn't notice. However, when I pulled the handle to open the door, it was also caked with mud underneath, as if someone had been attempting to open my door with a muddy hand. Nothing more occurred, but the whole encounter leaves chills covering my body the more I think about it. I was wondering if anyone could offer their thoughts, or an explanation on a paranormal experience that I had as a child. When I was 11, my younger sister passed away from a very sudden death. Months before this incident, I had a vision in the middle of the night that I had never made sense of until recently. I had woken up and saw a floating orb of white light in my room. Inside of it was a young child, around 4, maybe 5 years old, the same age as my late sister, with short hair, wearing a Victorian-style nightgown. I came close to it and stared at it for a minute or two, and then went back to sleep. The next day, I was filled with overwhelming anxiety and the feeling of someone's presence in the house. Only years after this vision and the death of my sister have I thought that this could possibly be some sort of omen or warning of her death. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. I grew up in rural Oregon with around 70 acres of wooded private property as my personal playground. By the time I was 16, I had spent countless hours exploring every square foot that I could and had never experienced anything any more unpleasant than poison oak and more than a few blackberry scratches. Oddly, there was one small portion of the property that I had never checked out. I couldn't tell you why I had never gone to this one little corner. I just never did. It was like an unconscious choice to just never go there. There was even an old trail or road leading back to it. One afternoon, I got the itch to turn left and follow that trail. The day was bright and warm. Nothing was sketchy or untoward. However, within 50 feet of the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming need to stop in my tracks. It was like stepping on a giant, sticky mouse trap. My feet simply wouldn't carry me any further forward. As I stood there, every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt absolutely sick to my stomach with dread. I spun in place, looking every direction for whatever danger my body was telling me was there. The spot where I stood was a bit of a clearing in the trees. I had about 20 feet or so of total visibility in all directions, and further in some. There was nothing, not so much as a bird or a bug. I've never felt such utter terror and the desire to go full knees to chest for the hills. I made my way back to the trailhead as fast as I could backpedal, and the second my feet left the trail, it all faded. Hairs back down, stomach settled, and zero sense of unease. It was like stepping out of a room and closing the door. For years I wondered what kind of presence I had encountered. Many naysayers tried to tell me that it was probably just a cougar and it was my sixth sense picking up on it. I wasn't buying it. Then, in talking to my parents one day, who used to wander that property when they were dating a few decades ago, I found out that they had come across the remnants of an old homestead there. It had deteriorated to the point where there was nothing left but the outline of the foundation and some old medicine bottles. I had a light bulb moment. Seems that maybe one of the homesteaders was still there, and I was definitely trespassing. I've had short-lived moments of temptation where I thought about going back there and seeing if I could replicate the experience. In all honesty, though, whatever was there was way too dark for me to ever want to encounter it again. It definitely seems best left alone.
My university was in a remote location surrounded by a river. It was almost like an island, very isolated, and during the weekend all the locals would go home, making it more eerie. This happened in 2014 when I was 22 years old. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I decided to sleep in my friend's room. Around 1 a.m. I woke up feeling thirsty. My friend was studying, so I decided to walk to my room and bring the water bottle as my room was on the other side of the corridor. There was an elevator at the end of the corridor, which played soft music, and you would know if the elevator was on your floor. So I walked toward my room, and as I turned right toward the corridor, I saw an unknown girl staring at the elevator without moving. First of all, I didn't know who she was, because we can usually tell which year a student is, especially after spending 3 to 4 years in the same place and looking at the same faces every day. Secondly, the girl was wearing denim jeans, sports shoes, and was carrying a backpack as if she had just come back from her class. What's strange about that is that the hostel door closes at 8 p.m. The girl was looking straight at the elevator buttons without even blinking. The elevator was still on our floor, so why wasn't she getting on? I could see the side of her face. It was a very strange stare. I don't know how to explain it. I automatically stopped walking after seeing her and got goosebumps all over my body. Something was stopping me from taking my steps forward. I stood there and watched her for about a minute. After that, I went running to my friend's room and asked her if she recognized the lady. When she came back, she wasn't there, and the elevator music was still playing. My friend didn't believe me, and I still don't know who or what that was. So the area is deep in the Monongahela Forest in Virginia. I was doing some hiking there alone, trying to explore the new area, seeing what's out there. Everything was going pretty smooth in general, except for one occurrence that had gotten me blown away completely. By the way, I'm a 37-year-old male, been hiking in forests and mountains many times, never had an issue. Anyway, so I'm walking in the forest. It was around 4 p.m. I was alone. I had everything on me, including a radio beacon, compass, GPS on my phone, and smartwatch. So as you can see, taking my precautions in case I get lost, so that I can figure out my whereabouts and get back. I also even had printed maps on me. While walking, I all of a sudden felt some sort of weird, very weird quietness. As if you know it was the vacuum. No birds chirping, just quietness. And what's extra weird about it was that it was so quiet that I could hear the humming in my ears that you sometimes get to hear in total silence. I'm thinking, okay, quite odd. First, though, is that there might have been a predator in the vicinity, so I was trying to keep an eye out for that. I did carry something to protect myself with just in case I got attacked. Anyway, I just keep walking. No predator, but the quietness was just there. It's strange. I did not even see any birds anymore, just trees. I also noticed that the weather started getting worse, it became cloudy in an odd way. I don't know how to explain it. Long story short, the weather got bad pretty much out of nowhere. At this point, I kind of started feeling I don't know how to describe it, I guess uneasiness. I decided to go back, and here's this. All of a sudden, the GPS is out on both my phone and my smartwatch, and the compass is spinning as if there's a magnet close by or something like that.
That got me very concerned because it pretty much means that I can't find out where to go in case I get lost. I started walking back. None of my navigational tools are working. I'm kind of still going back, just kind of orienting myself by the way that I came in. All of a sudden, I see the clouds above are really bizarre. It's like most of the clouds are weird and grayish in color, but they're not like clouds, but more kind of like fog, which is really way up. Then there was another cloud kind of surrounded by gray clouds, which was black. I've never seen a cloud look like that before. It was almost like the night sky. Then the craziness happened. All of a sudden, I hear music. Like a town clock bell or something like that, like, doing it every 10 seconds or so. I don't know, at the time I just got scared, really freaked out, and I just started running very, very fast back where I had come from. I was sprinting, and then eventually I noticed that the weather got better. It was no longer cloudy. The clouds weren't in fact visible anywhere near. I looked at my compass and GPS, and it was back up. I was, in fact, headed in the correct direction. After that, I just went back to the place where I had parked and left. Later that day, I looked up the weather forecast for that area. There wasn't supposed to be any cloudiness anywhere. It was supposed to be a sunny day with only sporadic clouds. I told my story to my buddies, also hikers. They say it might have been that I could have maybe fallen and maybe had a dream of that, but I don't think so because I don't remember falling or having a dream. Anyways, it's kind of a weird story. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but I don't know. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? I do believe in the paranormal. Not routinely and not as an explanation for everything, but I definitely believe that some things just can't be logically explained. I've dabbled in divination for the past couple years, which has led me to notice more universal symbolism and omens. Recently, I've seen some weird ones. I was driving around my area the other day and passed a funeral procession twice. It struck me as sort of unsettling and out of the ordinary. I drive around a lot, and I don't usually see funeral processions around just randomly. I was a little bit anxious by it, especially so when I passed the hearse itself, but I pretty much brushed it off. That same day, I was pulling into a drive-thru at around 3 a.m., and a black cat came out of seemingly nowhere. It strolled in front of the car and continued walking into nothing. It felt very rare to see, since I live in a well-populated suburb that doesn't usually have animals roaming about. This morning, there was a black cat watching my window on the windowsill of the house across from mine. As I looked at the cat, it began to thunderstorm. I know it all sounds really small and maybe a touch overzealous, but I couldn't help but feeling odd about these things because of how out of the ordinary that they felt, and silently spooky. Not to mention, all happening in the same couple of days. The closeness of it all made me curious, and I had to look into it, just to see if these things were things that other people believed to be bad omens. In my very unofficial research, I have found that 1. Passing a funeral can be bad luck and can, quote-unquote, hasten your own death. 2. In European folklore, a black cat crossing your path can be unlucky and lead to misfortune and death. Occasionally, however, they can represent good luck, but from what I've found, it's fairly situational. And 3. In Greek mythology, thunder could represent punishment to the humans by the gods, associated with Zeus. Clearly, death is kind of a theme here. All of this just doesn't sit well with me, and it's accompanied by a generally strange feeling that I've noticed prevailing in my mood lately. Something just feels off, you know? This happened on a hike up to Half Dome. We had a campground about a 20-minute drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of me, an 18-year-old male, my uncle, a 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend, I'll call him D. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christians, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feelings I will be talking about. We get to our campsite, set up camp, and go to sleep after eating. We plan to wake up at 4 and start to hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock, and I remember this odd feeling as if I was woken up by something. I remember looking out at the moonlit scene. The moon was very bright for some reason, and thinking to myself that it looks like a dream. I lay back in the hammock, but can't go to sleep, and end up waking up my uncle and friend at 3:50. My uncle asks me, "Were you walking around at night?" This is important, and I say no, and ask why. He says that he woke up for some reason and could hear someone walking around, not like an animal, but a person. I say, weird, and we brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, Dee says that he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple of before the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle, who forgot something in the car. The short, straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through a field a little. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to come out of the bathroom. We wait about 10 minutes before I go and check, and he isn't there. I get back to my uncle and tell him that. He says, "Weird, maybe he went back to the car or something," and we decide to wait a bit more. By 5:10, we begin worrying. My uncle goes to check the car while I wait at the intersection to make sure that we don't miss him if he went down the road away from the trailhead. My uncle returns and says he isn't there either. We decide maybe he went up the trailhead without us for some reason and walk up in there for about 10 minutes. He isn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there are no other logical places he would go. I decide to run back and check the car and the bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says that he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection that we weren't there, and that he just assumed that we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then met me. I say, "What do you mean? We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, bathroom, and trailhead, and you weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know. I went to the bathroom." He then asks me where my uncle is. I say at the trailhead, and he asks me again. I tell him again and note that it was weird that he was asking me twice. As we were crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him." And I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and it goes by as normal, except that we seem to keep losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girl's gloves, a water bottle, etc. It's like we simply just forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we possibly could have left them. On the way back, it got dark, and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it begins to seem as if we've been walking for too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taken way longer to get back?" I say, "Yeah, that I was just thinking that." We keep walking, but it still seems like we weren't making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and as I was walking, I couldn't spot any of the familiar landmarks. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, sort of a slight menacing sensation. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking, it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 more times about how long the hike is taking and start to laugh at it because it felt so ridiculous. After a bit, we finally and suddenly find ourselves on the final stretch and make it back to the car. Now, all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only just realized how weird those events felt after we got home and my aunt asks my uncle, "Were you camping?" And he says, "Yeah, how did you know?" As we didn't tell them we were going, since it was kind of last minute. She said that she had an odd dream where she saw my uncle in a tent in a forest somewhere, and there was someone outside of his tent. She said that she couldn't see who it was, but knew that there was a presence there. She says that she woke up around 3 and had the strongest urge to pray for him, and she did. My uncle kind of looks at me after hearing that like, "Are you serious?" I honestly don't know what to make of all of this.
Two years ago, I took my wife, my father, and son, then 3, to visit family in New England. They live on a small farm with buildings that date back to the 1700s, which have been restored and modernized. There's a guest house which was built around 20 years ago. My cousin is a prolific photographer, and my auntie had decorated most of the rooms in the main house and guest house with her photos. We didn't notice much about the photos in the guest house when we first arrived, probably because we were all jet-lagged. The next morning, after a sound sleep, we were sitting in the main family room eating breakfast and making plans for the day, when I noticed that my son was keeping his head down and not answering my father when he spoke to him, which was unusual, because even at that age, they were very close. I looked over to my dad, and noticed that he was sitting in front of a photo of a room in a rundown house. The room had a large window with sunlight streaming in, casting shadows across the length of the room toward a dark corner. I got an uneasy feeling from the photo, but didn't think much more of it. We finished breakfast and all got up from the table, and I noticed that my son was walking in a wide arc around the end of the table where my father had been sitting. Again, weird behavior, but I just dismissed it as a weird 3-year-old thing. Over the next day or so, I noticed him becoming more and more uneasy any time we were at the dining table, and doing whatever he could to avoid looking at that photo. I decided to ask him what was wrong, and he answered me very matter-of-factly, "The bad man in the picture is looking at me. He's very cold, and he's not nice." I looked back at the picture and instantly got chills down my spine. There was no man in the picture, but I got the feeling that there was more to it than an empty room. I decided to ask my cousin about the picture, and she told me that it was taken at an abandoned farm a bit further upstate. It was one of her favorite places, but had always given my aunt the creeps, so it was moved to the guest house. Over the next couple of days, whenever I would ask my son about it, he said things like, "The bad man is looking at me. He doesn't like me. He wants to hurt me." I didn't think much of it, until we were going to bed one night and my son tripped and fell, seemingly for no reason, in the middle of the hall, and started crying hysterically. When I asked him if he was okay, he told me, "The bad man hurt me on the leg." I checked his leg, and sure enough, on the side of his leg, there was a large bruise that looked as if he had been struck with a blunt object. I didn't want to play into his fears, but asked him how the bad man could hurt him if he was in the photo downstairs near the table. His answer was enough for me to pack up all of our stuff and move to the main house with my aunt, uncle, cousins, and big burly housekeeper right away. He said, "He's not down there. He comes up here when we go to bed." I never found out anything more about the farm where the photo is taken, but I'm sure that there was some kind of evil presence around it.
Back in the mid-'80s, we were traveling through Tennessee on the way to visit friends in Texas. Mom was driving, and I, a teenager at the time, was navigating by using a paper map, as these were the days before cell phones and GPS. We made it past Nashville on I-40 pretty late at night. We were maybe an hour outside the city. I was charting our progress old school with pencil and paper. We pass an exit, I mark it. A minute later, a summer thunderstorm hit. Visibility dropped to nothing. All traffic slows to a crawl, and we decide to pull off at the next possible exit and find a motel to spend the night, because there's no way that we're making significant progress in this storm. Slow, white-knuckle driving ensues. An exit looms up on the right, no signage that we can see in the downpour, and we take it. At the top of the exit ramp, we turned right toward a brilliantly lit up gas station. It was a left turn onto an overpass crossing I-40 with no lights from that side of the interstate. We were on a dinky little road at that point. To our right, there was a gas station which we're rapidly passing. To our left and back behind some trees was what appeared to be a motel, but you couldn't make out the sign well in the rain. We drove past the gas station before we really realized that the road just ended ahead. The gas station was the only building on this side of the road. It went from a 1.5 lane that was paved to a 1-lane gravel road. We could see a short way ahead. To tire track dirt and grass, all over the space of maybe 20 yards. Now, we were past this gas station, and there was only one turnoff from this road. It was on our left. We took it and tried to back up and turn around to get back to the gas station. Unfortunately, the paved slope of that narrow, driveway-sized turnoff led steeply down into a huge mud pit. No backing up out of it. My mom put the car into low gear, turned hard, and headed back for the gravel road through the mud. We almost made it, but got mired out. The front passenger tire caught on the corner of an exposed concrete storm drain, maybe 3 feet from the road. Out of the car, into the rain and mud. We walked to the gas station. The place was spotless, super bright, and had 2 young men behind the counter. What sounded like one of Elvis's songs was playing on their radio inside. Attendant's first words on seeing us walk in were, "Did you get stuck in the mud?" They said it as a super enthusiastic, way too happy greeting. Like Disney staffer welcoming you as you walk into the park for the first time levels of happy. Also, these night shift clerks were dressed in suits that looked about 30 years out of date. The place was kinda creepy. We admitted that we had, indeed, gotten stuck. We asked if there was a towing company that we could call. They pulled out a phone book. Again, this was before cell phones or the internet, and started talking to each other. It was not a Nashville phone book, some little township. Population couldn't have been more than 100 from the handful of white pages, but the book had dozens of yellow pages of nothing but tow truck companies. Like literally hundreds of tow truck companies for this town too small to appear on the map. The attendants had a friendly debate about whose turn it was to get a car out of the mud. They decided to skip over the company who was theoretically next because there had been some sort of problem with them the last time that they were called out for a tow. They made a decision on who to call and let my mom use their phone. More weirdness, and the creepiness intensifies. It was still storming, though less at that point. The truck arrives maybe 5 minutes later, brilliant white, not a speck of dirt or a drop of mud on it. I've seen vehicles in a new car lot that were dirtier. The two young men in the truck are also dressed like they had just stepped out of the 1950s. They were wearing freshly polished patent leather shoes without a drop of mud on them, along with starched white shirts, paper hats, and bow ties. We hike across the street next door to the mud pit where our car is stuck. The tow truck guys are horrified. They almost got out of the mud? They say to each other repeatedly. The subtext from their shocked tone is clear. No one must ever, ever escape the mud pit on their own. These people will have to take some sort of action to make sure that no one else gets as close as we did to escaping. They tow the car out. Easy peasy. We all go back to the gas station. We pay the tow truck drivers for services. The drivers let the gas station attendants know that my mom and I almost made it out of the mud on our own. The attendants, again, are horrified and shocked by this. By now we're getting huge, uncanny valley vibes from all four of these men, and not just them, the whole place is too clean, too brightly lit, and too weirdly out of date. It was a surprisingly good facsimile of a small town rest stop populated by real humans. Almost perfect, in fact. We are definitely in Creepy Town. If these guys were humans, there was seriously something off about them. If they weren't, they almost had their ordinary human act down pat. The truck drivers leave. The attendants turn, all super friendly again, and ask Mom and me if we're going to stay the night in the hotel across the road. They're so excited that we might spend the night here. They talk about how great it is. Mom and I make non-committal noises and return to the car. I tell Mom we're not staying here tonight. She agrees wholeheartedly. The rain is finally letting up. We drive down I-40 to the very next exit. It was maybe 5 miles. We pull off and spend the night in a kind of crappy but ordinary motel. At least it's not the Bates Motel, we joke. The rest of the trip goes well. Then, several days later on the way home, Mom and I decide that we would really like to see the creepy town in the light of day. It couldn't have been that weird, could it? Heading back up I-40, we pass the exit where we actually did spend the night on the way down. We can see the hotel, the exit number matches the notes that I had made on the map, everything. Then we start looking for the next exit. The exit to Creepy Town. Should be about 5 miles along with an overpass. 5 miles pass. No exit. No overpass. 5 more miles later before we find the next exit off of I-40. It's the one that I had marked as being right before the storm first hit. In short, Creepy Town does not exist. I have traveled I-40 many times since, often remarking that, hey, there's that exit where the weird storm hit and we went to Creepy Town, and there's the exit that we actually did spend the night at. We never found the Creepy Town exit between those 2 points, ever again. I'd like to start this off by saying that I'm an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. But I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar that he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy. We got together a couple times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup, who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River about 5 to 6 miles in. We packed all our gear, and even a backpack for my dog, and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Douglas firs covered with moss. Sometimes there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down and it was almost completely dark by the time that we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning in their hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, there were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever. He kept saying that it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked, and it was awesome. You can look up Bolt Camp online. It's a wooden 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. A tree had come down on it at some point, and the pics you see of it partially smashed are how it was for us. It was still more than intact enough to sleep in, though. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left half a bottle of scotch. We partook in that, and when we left, we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steaks on rocks, got drunk, and fell in love. I fell asleep first. I slept towards the inside of the shelter, my now husband and dog toward the outside. It was late October, and while it was dry, it was very, very cold, and the fire refused to stay lit. Eventually, he fell asleep too. My Saint Leo kept growling into the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both asleep when I woke up. Thinking it was around 2:30 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter. Then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I really, really wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came. I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage, and hiked back. I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night, and moved in together a couple months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house. That same evening, he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing, turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it, and finally it settled into a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look, and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided that he wanted no part, and ran back indoors. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen, and how I was too embarrassed to share before. The similarities are just too great. It had to have been the same thing. I traveled quite a bit when I was younger, specifically in the Pacific Northwest of the US, as that's where I'm from.
Whenever my single mother, older sister, and I took a break at the various rest stops along the way, I was almost always met by an older woman, likely in her 50s, early 60s. She offered my sister and I a variety of treats, generally hot cocoa and cookies, or lemonade depending on the weather. We always took it graciously. I think my mom assumed that we always bought the things with our allowance at the little shop that's sometimes integrated into the rest stop buildings. But I always remember that woman being at a white plastic table with black legs and never charging us any money. She never spoke. She was the highlight of many trips. I always felt safe and attribute her presence with my love for road trips and rest stops in general. Well, I brought her up a few years back in conversation with my mom and sister, and while my sister seemed to remember her, my mom did not, and pointed out how ridiculous that would be. I honestly hadn't thought much of it since I was 8 or 9, and just took her to be part of the travel experience. But our trips spanned everywhere between Idaho and California, and I know that I saw her at least once every trip from ages 5 to 8. As the chances of us coincidentally meeting so often without my mom noticing are very slim, I can only assume that there was something going on. I know that this could be a muddled memory and have generally ruled it out as one, but I have had many ghost experiences as a child that I hesitate to abandon entirely. Does anyone else have any similar experiences that might be related? If this kind woman is still helping wandering children keep their bellies warm, I would love to leave her a thank you on my next voyage. I have been fascinated by ghosts and the supernatural my entire life. I've had a few experiences here and there, but this one in particular was the most significant and frightening. First, some background. My dad's side of the family is Native American, and some have a deep suspicion of owls. They're considered evil omens. Anyways, my grandmother was very, very attuned to spirits. She had the so-called second sight. She had a whole wealth of stories about her encounters with the paranormal, who she passed on to my aunt. But anywho, this next bit is relevant. A few months before she passed away from lupus, she woke up in a panic and came running into my aunt's room. My grandmother was generally a stoic, unflappable woman, so this was not like her. She dragged my aunt into her bedroom asking if she heard it. My aunt heard nothing. What my grandmother had heard was the so-called death owl. She passed on not too long after that. Fast forward about 10 years or so, I'm up around 4 a.m. watching TV. As I recall, it was around December of 2008. I heard this noise outside. It sounded like a woman weeping. The best way I can describe it was a voice that was caught between an owl's cry and a human's. It was very unnatural. I got a cold feeling in my gut because I knew exactly what it was, and it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I grew up out in the country, and I know what an owl sounds like. I've also heard bobcats, foxes, and the dying screams of rabbits. This was none of those things. Others have tried to claim that it was just an animal, but it was like no other animal I've ever heard. That unearthly wailing noise, like it was in mourning. It was the kind of sound that freezes the blood in your veins. At the time, I thought it might be foretelling my father's imminent death, since if you hear it, it either means that you or a family member is going to die, or it predicts great disaster. And for clarification, at the time, my dad was having some significant heart trouble, but he's much better now. Now comes the twist.
On April 9th, 2009, a huge wildfire swept through my area. A lot of houses burned down, and mine was among them. When we came back, my home was nothing but a pile of smoking rubble. It took me a bit to make the connection, but I am positive that the death owl, or banshee, was an omen that predicted this disaster. One thing's for sure, I hope to God that I never hear that thing again, because I will never forget it. I have a suspicion that this thing stalks my family. I can't be certain. I'll have to do some research into my family tree. I know this might sound unbelievable to some, but I swear till the day that I die that this is all 100% true. So there you have it, folks. My most significant paranormal encounter.
I lost my dad a couple of years ago to ALS. It was a rough way to go. We were very close. I'm an only child and a daddy's girl. We always promised each other, whoever went first, that we would try to reach out from the other side. There have been many ways that he's been in touch. Some have been more subtle, like giving me the strong urge to hear a song that's not my usual genre, country, but while I was deeply grieving, I suddenly had to hear Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. I always thought that was just a breakup song, but when I played it on Spotify and listened to it, much different. The lyrics are about losing someone, but that we'll be walking hand in hand again in the land that knows no parting. In the afterlife, in other words. I knew as I heard it that it was a direct message. Also, he came to me in a dream. You know the difference between if it's just a vision or a dream, and this was the only actual visit. For about a year after he died, the standing lamp in my living room would come on its own every now and then. I would just say, "Hi, Dad." One night while I was taking the dog out before bed, it was a full moon in February of 2020 about midnight, I witnessed a small rock being kicked toward me out in the street in front of my house. There was no wind that night, and even if there were, wind doesn't blow rocks, much less uphill. He always rather liked to kick rocks if he passed them as we walked the dog, so it seems like a dad way to reach out. So I said, "Hi, Dad." I kept the rock. But the most recent things left me with some very sweet keepsakes. First, he left an orange heart in my robe pocket. I don't wear my robe outside the house anywhere. I have no idea how it got there, just a little paper cutout of a heart. Orange was his favorite color. He loved bright colors. I said, "I love you too, Daddy." I taped it to my bathroom mirror to remind me that he is still okay and that he still loves me. Then, about a month later, my hubby and I were cuddling one weekend morning, and we heard a loud bang from the garage downstairs. We didn't realize what it was until later in the day. I saw the back door had been slammed open somehow, and had been open all day long. I closed the door and mused about how odd that it was that it had opened with such force when it hadn't been windy, and that there were no vibrations or anything. The next day I go to do laundry. The machine is in the garage, and at my feet in front of the washing machine is a yellow felt heart with sheet music cut out in a heart shape glued to the front of it. My dad was a pianist, and music was everything to him. It was a little dirty. I can't imagine where he got it from, or what it had to blow through to get to my garage door. I think he opened the door the day before so that he could get that heart in there somehow. It was just above and beyond. I don't know how hard it is to do that kind of thing from the other side, but I just feel so very loved that he went to the trouble and found a way somehow. I taped that one to my mirror as well. Lastly, on my parents' anniversary this January, Mom woke up to a light on in the living room. It was the light on the wall that used to hang above Dad's recliner, an old-fashioned looking one with 2 separate bulbs. He loved that light. He had it on a little remote plug and everything. When he got ALS, I put it on a smart plug so that he could tell Alexa to turn it on for him, until talking became too difficult anyway. but it stopped working with Alexa right after he died. So Mom hasn't turned it on herself since then because she has back pain and can't be bending over to rotate the little switch that's on the cord. After a couple years off, suddenly it was on their anniversary. She left it on all day. After an entire year alone, mostly because of COVID, I think she especially needed that sign that he was still with her. It was the first physical sign that she's ever gotten from him, and it's proof that love never really dies.
For a little backstory, my partner and I have been dating for about a year and a half. This February, I was given tickets as a birthday gift to finally visit him, as I'm in Scotland. Experience 1. I spent the middle of February over in Arizona visiting my partner. While we're both interested in the paranormal, I believe in it all, having had multiple experiences, whereas he tends to just humor me, not believing in it much himself. He's never mentioned anything odd happening in his apartment, but I saw, heard, and felt small things the first couple of days that I was there. One morning in particular at around 4 a.m. I was on the sofa playing on my phone, jet lag, when I looked up and saw a figure standing over him as he slept. It was similar to a shadow person phenomenon, just a dark humanoid shape, but it felt nasty. When I saw it, it turned almost as if it was startled to see someone else in the room. Never mind, someone who could also see it. It did sort of a double take and then disappeared, but the energy in the room felt off. I performed a cleansing ritual that I've come to rely on when negative energies are bothering me. For the remainder of my trip, the apartment felt light and airy, with the exception of later that day when I was taking a nap and felt what I thought was my partner standing over me watching me sleep. I opened my eyes and felt the negative presence over me, as though trying to work out who I was and why I was there. It was then told in very clear terms that it wasn't welcome, whether I was there or not, and it cleared out. No more issues, so that was fine. Experience 2. My partner's friends, another couple, really helped in making me feel welcome, and the 4 of us went out on road trips a couple of times, once to Jerome and another to a recreational spot by a lake. I felt a little funny anytime we were driving around near or on the reservations, as though the native spirits were very much aware of us going through their land, but nothing felt bad, just sort of a curiosity. But one instance in particular sticks out. While driving toward Phoenix after a day at the lake, we were all chatting away in the car when we got into reservation territory. I got that not alone feeling again, but still, it was curious, though this time it was more intense. There was a lull in the conversation, and I was just admiring the landscape as the sun was going down, when in the middle of the center embankment on the road, there was a figure that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I know it was male, and I know that he was a Native American. Nothing felt wrong, but when I asked if anyone else had seen him, they all said no, despite the fact that, as far as I was concerned, you couldn't miss him. He was old, tall, and completely white. His clothes, hair, everything, with an aura of hazy light around him, simply standing and watching over the road. I don't know who he was, but it felt like he was watching over the people traveling through his land. It was comforting. I'm an OTR truck driver, which means that I drive across the country multiple times in a month-long period. I'd like to share a story with you. On a dark July night around 2 a.m., I was headed south on US 93 highway in Nevada. I was approximately 30 miles north off of Las Vegas. Traffic was scarce. I had not seen a single vehicle for at least 40 minutes. The only source of light that illuminated the road were the truck headlights. I was on the phone with a friend of mine just chatting about random stuff when in the distance about 300 feet ahead of me I saw something on the shoulder of the road. At first I thought it might have been a turned over construction sign or a bag of some sort. But as I was approaching the object, I started to make out some features. It was a human-like figure, I thought. Just to be clear, that area is deserted and there's absolutely nothing to be found within a 25-mile radius. When I was about 5 yards away, I could see it clearly. It was a boy. He was around 8 to 10 years old, I'd say. He had a school backpack and a white plush bunny in his right arm held tightly against his chest. He was just standing there with his cold stare, completely unemotional, looking me directly in the eyes. He didn't break the stare as I passed him. He didn't even blink or flinch, and let me remind you that it's an 80,000-pound semi-truck moving at 65 miles an hour. My heart was racing. My whole body was covered in goosebumps. A cold chill went down my spine. I don't think that I have ever been so disturbed in my life since I've never had any paranormal encounters. Once I passed him, the first thing that came to my mind was that if I see him appear again a couple of miles ahead, I'm gonna have a heart attack. But thankfully, it never happened. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I still don't know what it was. I'm not trying to claim that it was a ghost or the spirit of a deceased child. I just can't find any adequate explanation to it. It was definitely not a hallucination since I was wide awake and talking on the phone. It just seems weird to me. What in the world was a 10-year-old kid doing by himself in the middle of a desert? One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radio my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. When I was 3 years old and living with my mom at the time, we bounced around a lot from house to house. We ended up moving into a house that was just a few blocks away from my dad. I just want to state that these are my very first memories. I don't remember anything before this house. That's how traumatic that it was for me. But I'll do my best to explain these experiences in an adult version because I was 3 at the time and still hadn't learned to talk very well. So we move in, and I don't remember anything out of the ordinary happening right away, but soon I would start seeing this red man or bad man or fireman. My mom told me that's always what I would call him because I have very little memory of what I would call this thing. I vividly remember it wanting to hurt me. I don't know how I knew, but I knew that I wasn't safe every time I saw him. Sometimes he would chase me down the halls or come through the walls, and I would run to my mom trying to explain what was happening. My mom said that I would run up to her crying and shaking, saying that the bad man was trying to hurt me. This thing kept going on, and eventually something else started happening. Every time this red man would try and hurt me, this new entity would show up. I say entity because I couldn't tell its gender, and I don't remember it having a face, but it was like it was a glowing ball of light that would chase away the bad man every time he was around. This went on for months before I finally moved in with my dad. Because I was so scared constantly, I actually developed a stutter, and my whole body would tremble. One day while living at my dad's, I was drawing, and my mom asked if I could draw what I was seeing. I was drawing in a coloring book, and one page had an angel on it, and I started drawing circles around it because I couldn't actually see what it was. In my mind, it was just a big ball of white energy. I'm not Christian and don't believe in angels or demons, but I do believe in negative energies and positive ones that could maybe manifest into ghosts or spirits. So at this point, I had permanently moved in with my dad. I went to speech therapy for a long time to fix the stutter, and now, even to this day, my hands shake. Apparently, it's called trauma tremors. After moving in with my dad, my mom and brother, who had never seen anything weird like I did, just saw my reactions to it. Both started experiencing things. Not as bad as what had happened to me, but still creepy as hell. My mom would start to hear the piano play, and my uncle played the piano, so she thought that it was him playing it, until she walked over there and realized that no one was in the room. My brother would see shadows and lights turn off by themselves, but that's all that really happened to them. My mom eventually moved out of that house because too many things were going on and she really was getting creeped out. Me and her moved into a trailer, and the first night there, I was laying in bed with her, and I was apparently staring into the bathroom. I don't remember this, but my mom does. And she asked what I was staring at, and I said, "There's a man standing in the bathtub." And she then asked, "Is he a good man or a bad man?" I said, "A good man," and went to sleep right after. We later found out that the owner of the trailer before us was an old man who had died. Ever since then, I've never seen any paranormal things, but I can still sense if houses have good or negative energies. Believe this story or not, but it was very real to me and has permanently given me a tremor. When I was older, probably around 7, and could fluently speak, my family asked me if I remembered what had happened at the house. I guess they thought that I forgot or had made it up, and I told them the story in astounding detail, and it freaked everyone. Me and my mom occasionally talk about this from time to time because we still don't know what had happened. We just know it did, and that it was messed up. A few years ago, a friend and I took a road trip across country. We stopped at an out-of-the-way place in Wyoming late at night. As soon as we rolled up, we both felt as if it were haunted, but really needed to sleep, so we checked in and put anything paranormal out of our minds. The place was very run down. We had 2 beds in our room. Mine was closest to the door and window with a nightstand in between us. Also, we each had a little lamp above our beds. I laid down, clicked off my lamp, and was facing the window. While lying down, I saw a black, shadowy figure cross the length of the wall and then vanish. About 30 seconds later, after I had laid my head down, my friend began playing with my hair. I sat upright and said, "What the?" But she was in her bed, 5 feet away, reading her book. I didn't say anything because, as mentioned, we just wanted to sleep. Later that night, my friend woke me and asked if she could sleep in my bed with me. I said yes, but didn't ask why. That morning, we had confession time. I told her that I thought that she was playing with my hair, that's why I sat up in bed before falling asleep. She said that she had looked over and saw a black, shadowy figure hovering above me at the moment when I had looked up. During the night, after she had turned her light off, someone was playing with her feet, rubbing them, massaging them, etc. She couldn't get any sleep and was freaked out, which is why she cowered over to my bed. That morning, we asked the waitress in the very creepy stuffed animal heads on the wall, dark, musty coffee shop if the place was haunted. She said she wasn't allowed to comment on that. We pressured her to tell us the history of the place. She told us that the hotel used to be POW bunkers, where the Chinese had been held or something like that, around World War II. Anyway, I've wanted to go back for a while, and I'm wondering, have any of you had similar experiences? The hotel was in Wyoming, well off the beaten path. I was reading somebody's Reddit post today where they talked about their mother being scared because she heard 3 knocks and related it to the 3-knock omen, which I had never heard of. I decided to do some research on it, and apparently there's a superstition around hearing 3 knocks because it's supposedly followed by a death in the family or someone that's close to you. That has happened to me. A couple years ago, I went to a mountain resort in California for a little over a month, and stayed with my sister and brother-in-law who lived there. Around the same time when I came, they got a new roommate. He was a nice guy, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, an ex-alcoholic, but overall, just a really great guy. I spent a lot of my summer going on hikes and playing video games with him and my brother-in-law, and I would say that I got to know him pretty well, but not as well as my sister and her husband did. The roommate, Jack, had lost a close friend a year or so before when he got drunk and decided to fall asleep outside in the middle of a snowstorm, which apparently happens more often than you would think. Since then, Jack had never so much as touched a beer, and he was quite proud of it. Anyways, it was around my 3rd or 4th week there, when my sister and I were watching The Babadook, and it was pretty late at night, around 1, maybe 2 a.m. The movie ended, and she was going to let me sleep in the room with her since Jack and her husband were out camping or something, but I don't really remember what they were doing. It was silent in the house, and all the lights were off when we heard 3 loud, distinct knocking sounds. I asked her if she had heard them, and she said yes, but it was probably just the dryer making noises upstairs. It was a fairly new dryer that didn't make any sound. Maybe around 10 minutes later we heard the same 3 knocks again, but my sister wrote it off to the dryer being noisy once more. It didn't sound like a broken dryer, since it was 3 obvious knocks, though. I don't want to go too far into the history of the house or anything, but it was definitely haunted. Things would randomly fly off of shelves, and the lights would randomly turn themselves off. Also, some of the furniture that the house came with had what we thought were blood stains. I wrote that night off to the spirit in their house messing with us since we were watching a scary movie, up until today, when I put everything together. 2 days after I left, they found Jack dead in his room upstairs. They said he drank himself to death, which was surprising considering how proud he was of getting sober. Maybe the death knocks were real, or maybe not. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. What do you think? Also, I should probably also mention that he had a bad liver from his previous drinking problem. I don't really know how that works, but I guess one night of extremely heavy drinking did it for him. I didn't push for more information about his death since it really shook my sister up. All she said was that he drank himself to death. Disclaimer: in no way am I saying that death knocks are 100% real, or that if you hear them, a family member or friend will definitely drop dead. As for the furniture that we thought had blood on it, it might not have been blood. Maybe it was just an odd-colored stain from where something had been spilled. I'm not saying that I'm sure that Jack's death was related to anything that happened in the house. I just made the connection and found it fascinating.
I'm living in an older century 3-story house in a small town in Ontario. I was laying on the first set of stairs beside the front door next to my dog, I think taking his leash off for a walk. He's a big boxer shepherd full of love. Anyways, I hear this very loud and unusual sound, like something has come loose or broken. I'm home alone. I actually thought maybe it had come from the basement because I was so close by there. But then I realized that it was not, because the sound had gotten further away. I went up to the 3rd floor, which is actually like a split level with 2 empty rooms. Both remain empty since we've lived here, my wife and I. I go upstairs, not sure what I was expecting, but generally am a very logical human being. We have old bedroom doors with skeleton key handles, and when I get upstairs, I see that one handle is literally shaking up and down, almost vibrating. It didn't just go on for a couple of seconds. Remember, it carried on from when I went to check the basement and went upstairs, and now, as I was staring at it, it continued to vibrate. I grabbed the handle to make it stop, which it did completely. I opened the door to see nothing there and nothing in the room across either. We keep both doors closed, and the windows closed, and also the vents closed because we don't want heat or cool coming up to a floor that we don't even use. To this day, I have not figured out what caused this, and it hasn't happened since. Note, I don't remember any behavior from my dog. He may have been a bit timid, but he gets like this whenever my mood shifts to anxiety. There's one other experience that I had in our home. Our dining room is attached to the garage, and it is not a proper exterior door. It's another old, beautiful wooden door with a skeleton key and all. One day as I was cleaning, I shut the door just enough so that it was closed but not fully sealed, which I do this all the time. I went to my bedroom and heard the door to the garage swing open. Again, no other surrounding windows were open that could have made the air shift. Nothing was different than any other day when I do this. One other side note, my dog is terrified of our rocking chair. It's an old one that I had spray painted black. Never thought anything of it because honestly this dog is kind of scared of everything. He doesn't like certain flooring, which I'm assuming is because he must have had a bad fall at our old house or something, because even if I put a big piece of meat treat for him across a tiled floor, he won't enter. And yes, we trim his claws, so I'm thinking it's a bit of trauma or a phobia. He's a big baby, so it's probably nothing but just another weird thing to the house. Any ideas on the shaking handle, though? It was aggressive, and even if something was in an empty room, something, say, fell on it, causing it to shake, why wouldn't it stop?
Since childhood, I've had my fair share of paranormal experiences, especially while sleeping. I've had one particular entity visit me in my dream for 1 year when I was in a different house. Never seen that entity again once I moved, even though I lived in the same area. Just a lot of weird stuff like this. But last night, I had the weirdest experience of my life. I was sleeping in bed with my wife, and I dreamt that my wife kissed me and went under the blanket. I woke up and sat on the bed with my lower body covered with a blanket. I checked on my wife, but she wasn't in the bed. That was so strange. So if my wife was not in the bed, then who kissed me? While I'm thinking about this, realizing that my wife was outside in the living room, something started moving under the covers. It was like a snake or a tentacle that started wrapping around my legs. I kid you not, I was freaked out, and at the same time I was very calm because everything was smooth and non-aggressive. It felt like something were cuddling my legs. I slapped myself to make sure that I was awake, and I was, white as day. Holy smokes, I thought, this thing is moving and cuddling in the sheets, and it was bloody real. As the thing moved from my thighs to my shins, I literally saw the blankets move with it. Then I freaked out a little more, but not enough to stop it. I couldn't help myself, I was still curious. I kept sitting on my bed while the thing moved to my shin. I felt it wrap around both my legs and just stay in that position, like a ghost hug. I moved my foot up and down, just to check to see if this was anything like sleep paralysis, but it wasn't. My foot was fine. Everything was moving. I was moving. That thing was moving, and I was wide awake. But now it was getting really freaky, and I had to get out of it. I slowly pulled the blanket off, and whatever that was, I couldn't see. It slowly unwrapped and went away. I got up and went to my wife, told her the story, and we came back to bed. We woke up the next morning, and here I am, still freaked out, hoping that it was an act of love by whatever, and nothing more. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. A couple of years ago, me and my pops decided to go on a road trip. It was very out of the blue. I wasn't even expecting it, but I decided to go anyways. It would be some solid father-son bonding time. After driving for what seemed like a couple of hours, was around maybe 8 to 9 p.m., we pulled into this gas station for snacks, water, and to use the bathroom, and we went back inside of our car. Keep in mind, this gas station was basically in the middle of nowhere. Anyways, we got back into our car and decided to look for a motel, but there was none. And I mean not a single one anywhere near us.
My dad was really tired, so we just decided to go to sleep in the vehicle. We pulled up into this sort of resting area / parking lot and decided to pass out for the night. My dad fell fast asleep, but I was on my phone for a couple more hours, and around 11 p.m. I just felt suffocated by the tense air and decided to step out for a bit. I felt safe because the gas station was still in sight, and there would be a couple of trucks that would occasionally drive by, so I was at ease. At the time, I was also texting my friend who lives in Seattle, Washington. We were on the phone for a little while. Then I saw what looked like a large cornfield, and I had never actually seen a cornfield in real life, so I decided to cross the road and just get a closer look. That's exactly what I did. I got extremely close, and I started feeling like I was being watched, but again I just thought, well, you're literally outside in the dark, standing next to a tall cornfield, of course you're going to feel this way. So I just brushed it off. I even considered going in, but I thought, why would I even do that? So anyways, I just decided to take a step back when I noticed a barn. It was a large, white barn with red, maybe black stripes. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it was definitely a barn. I was stupid and young when this happened, maybe 14 or 15. Out of curiosity, I decided to go check it out, and the barn was next to the cornfield, sort of tucked in a little. I literally thought, haha, I wish I could see something that would freak me out, as a joke, because I never really thought that anything would happen, and I love being scared. Anyways, I started making my way toward the barn. As I was getting closer and closer, I remembered very vividly that I was wearing no socks, just slip-on slides. I remember the dirt rubbing against my toes as I stepped. I remember sending pictures to my friend in Washington. I jokingly was saying that I saw something and that I was going to check it out. As I got closer, I saw something. It was behind the barn, but sort of off to the side, like how when someone peers around a corner. I thought it was a bell. Literally, I assumed that it was a bell attached to the corner of the barn, so I just walked a little closer. Even as I'm writing this, I am getting goosebumps. I walked closer and saw the head of someone or something just peering around the corner at me. At that moment, I just straight up froze. My fight or flight was out of function because there I was literally seeing someone or something peering at me. After about 5 to 10 seconds, the noise that Snapchat makes when you get a notification snapped me out of it, and I just ran as fast as I could across the road to my dad's car and got in. I felt a sense of relief wash over my body. Somehow my dad was not awake. Me gasping for air wasn't enough to wake him from his deep sleep. I really considered waking him up and telling him what I saw and that we had to leave, but he would just assume that I was joking or having an episode. Which sounds dumb, but he's assumed that before, since he never has believed in anything paranormal or anything out of the ordinary related. I took deep breaths and just texted my friend telling her what I saw, and even she didn't believe me. I don't blame her. And I wouldn't blame any of you either. Sometimes I have a hard time actually believing what I saw. But I know that it was real. I was sober and fully aware. But from the bottom of my heart, the part that disturbs me the most is that whatever was peering at me from around that corner was very tall. At least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and every time I think about this, I get a sense of dread and paranoia. I haven't told any of my family or my dad, but if any of you have a clue as to what I might have seen, please let me know. Again, I wasn't hallucinating. This was before I even figured out anything about psychedelics or drugs in general. Please let me know if you have any ideas or info. Also, it probably sounds fake because if someone came to me telling me what I'm saying, I would also just rule it out to be fake. But please, I've been trying to piece it together for the last couple of months. I was sort of 50-50 on paranormal encounters, but after that experience, I believe. I believe in walkers to wendigos. I believe in ghosts to La Llorona. It has changed me, knowing what's out there. And everyone wants to believe, oh yeah, ghosts aren't real. But I feel like they are deep down. We know that there is some messed up stuff out there in this world. And I happened to encounter something. This is my one and only paranormal or unexplained experience. I was never exactly a believer, but I'd never completely disregarded the existence of the otherworldly. It happened a few years ago, sometime in the winter of 2016. I randomly woke up in the middle of the night, and the first thing that I noticed was how dark that my room was. It was supposed to be dark, as I had all my lights off and the windows closed, but you know, a little bit of tiny light from the outside street light always finds a way to enter from the edges of closed windows, like you can barely distinguish the pitch black from a slight aura, right? But there was none of it. It was pitch black all around. I thought it was probably a power outage, and I started to think random stuff like, probably this is what blind people see all their life. Must be sad. And slowly drifting back into sleep, when I was suddenly reawoken by the feeling of my bed shaking. I thought I had fallen asleep, and this is one of those sleep jerks that happen when you fall into your dream. But then more stuff started to happen. Soon after the first shake, there was a second one, which I felt much more clearly. A big rat had been invading our kitchen for a while, and I thought maybe it had somehow snuck into my room. But how could a rat shake my bed? Then, a few seconds later, I felt a literal punch under my bed, as if someone had punched the underside of my mattress right beneath where I was laying. I felt the mattress bump up in the center of my back. Oddly enough, instead of freaking out, I became extremely calm. And oddly enough again, I started to think of a logical reason. My mom made me check under my bed before sleeping, as she thought that some thief might have snuck into our home. She overthinks a lot. I thought that maybe someone actually had snuck in this time, but why would he disturb me instead of... And I felt another 2 consecutive punches from under me, right as I was having that thought. I froze for a solid minute, finally realizing that things might be abnormal here. Maybe I'm bragging, but after freezing initially, I went weirdly calm again, almost as if my brain went, oh no, it's a ghost. Anyway... There was a final punch, followed again by the bed shaking. I remember as the bed was shaking, I got up almost subconsciously, walked straight to the light switch on the other side of the room, and turned the lights on. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I looked under my bed with a flashlight. Also nothing. I should have freaked out here, but I didn't, which is really odd for someone like me who gets nervous and shaky for even the simplest social situations. My body worked almost on its own. I turned the lights off, took the flashlight with me to bed, and fell asleep as soon as I hit the mattress. And then it was morning. Nothing ever happened after that.
You have no reason to believe me, and you probably won't. I don't care. I just need to speak my truth, as it weighs on me sometimes. Since it happened in July, I told myself that I would take it to my grave out of fear. Fear of my significant other, family, and friends thinking that I'm crazy and ostracizing me. I have no history of mental illness, and I don't take meds, but I also just don't want to scare them. In July, around 10 to 12 a.m., I went to the kitchen with a blanket over me to grab a fork and a drink. I was carrying the drink in my right hand and the fork in my left as I struggled to keep the blanket wrapped around me. As I was heading back to the living room, I realized that the downstairs light and the ceiling light were on. I turned off the downstairs light with my left hand and looked to confirm that it was off. The ceiling lights were closer, so I continued on to turn the ceiling lights off behind me while looking down the stairs. The ceiling light flickered and burnt out, and I froze. A blue light appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and I cried, but it wasn't out of fear. I was already in a good mood, and it felt comforting. I stared, and tears continued to pour down my cheeks. In awe, I walked left past the corner and stood there and continued to cry. For 3 minutes I stood there like that, questioning what I had seen. It appeared instantly after the lights burnt out. Could it have always been there? Who knows? I doubted my sanity, and by the time I went back to look down the stairs, it was gone. As much as I try to forget, the emotional attachment to what happened always helps me remember. I had to make a decision that night. Carry on with my life, or keep asking questions that I didn't have the answers to and let it consume me and destroy me. I accepted that I may never know what it was, just that it is my truth, and I don't want to be afraid to share it. This happened a few years back, on my spring break, senior year of high school. I was hiking part of the Long Trail, which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington, and it was the usual very cold nights, warm, muddy days Vermont usually has in spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day and rest my feet, go swimming in a pond and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some Mountain House beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the flames. I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-traveled section of the trail. I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, 9-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky or a freight train right next to me. Then dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just absolute quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if there was anyone out there, but I just started hearing a really subtle, droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a brass string or radio static, but super low-pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky and the sound get quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and sprinted back to the main trail and found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. I had a weird series of encounters as a child in my hometown that I have since moved back to, and I just chalked it up to sleep deprivation mixed with having a vivid imagination. This first one happened when I was really little. I'd say in 2004 maybe, 2003? I suck with dates. This was one of the first experiences that I had, and it's pretty fuzzy. All I really recall is being at the top of a flight of stairs and jumping down the whole thing, almost as if I could float down. I looked back on this one and I thought that maybe I had fallen down the stairs and just didn't remember. But in that case, I would have gotten a ton of scrapes and bruises because it was a big wooden staircase. Likely not related to the other experiences I had, but still, weird. There was some weird stuff in between these two, but I'd rather just get to the meat of it. Anyways, here's the biggest one that really bothers me. When I was in middle school, I was incredibly rebellious, and decided to try running away from home in the fall of 2014. I got up in the middle of the night, and just decided to walk straight down the road. Not sure what my plan was there. Anyways, I ended up following the highway until I ended up around Thunderbolt, east of where I lived, and was stupidly proud of myself for not chickening out, and that I'd stopped crying. Anywho, I wandered some more, hopped some fences amid my adrenaline high, and ended up in these dense, really trashy woods. I started thinking over things, and crying again. Then I heard what sounded like my mom calling out my name from up on the highway, and instinctively ran away from it. I remember looking up to the highway and just seeing a person go limp and fall off the side and under the overpass in my direction, then start running toward me on all fours like some kind of creature. It was super dark, and I couldn't make out any features at all, and I wasn't interested in getting closer. So I just ran like the damn wind until my legs were shaking and I sat down in the underbrush. I was resting for a bit and still shaking and crying and all that. Then I heard my mom calling my name again. It sounded like it was the exact same volume, like it was from the same distance away. It almost sounded like a mosquito buzzing super quietly in my ear. I passed out for the night and then found my way back home in the morning. I thankfully ended up getting home safely, and all I got was bars on my window, scolding from my mom, and a sandal to the head. Oh, and sleep paralysis just about every night of my life since. I come from the county where Ireland's most haunted house, Loftus Hall, is located. If you want to know the history of Loftus Hall and the original story to it, I'm sure you can find it on Google. People that have visited all have their own stories of experiences at the house, and I'm going to share with you some of my experiences that I've had over the years. I lived about a 30 minutes drive away from it, so it was a destination that we visited a lot. I remember the first time I visited the grounds of the house. I was maybe 5 or 6 years old and was visiting it with my uncle. As we drove up the long lane leading the way to the house, I remember looking at all of the windows and getting a shiver as we approached. We parked and got out of the car. I stood and stared at the house. We walked around the grounds and around to the side of it where, at the time, there were apple trees. We picked some of them, as they were red and juicy, and put them in a bag to bring them home with us. When we got home and got the apples out of the bag, every single one had a rotten part on one side. I mean, a big, green, soft, gooey lump on all of them. Another time, when I was around 14, I had went to Loftus Hall with my friend and his mom. There's a nearby lighthouse that's open for people to visit, and we went there first. When we got to the house, there were a few people around, and a young American family there. A mom, dad, and 2 girls, aged around 5 and 9-ish. The 2 girls were running around and playing on the grounds when they ran to their parents laughing, and the 9-year-old said, Mommy, Ann wants to show us something. Can we go to her room?" Now, this may seem like normal child behavior, but Anne is the name of the girl in the original haunting story of Loftus Hall. I must also mention that the actual house was not open for guests to go in and out of as they pleased. Not at that time. When I was 16, that was my first time going into the house. We booked a tour on Halloween night. There were some ghost hunters who do an overnight stay every year, and a certain amount of guests can stay there with them for the night. We arrived and went in. We set up our sleeping bags while the ghost hunter crew set up their equipment. We took the tour of the house at night with a tour guide and in groups of 5. We went to each room with the guide giving the story behind it. We got to a room called the Tapestry Room. This is the most famous, and apparently most haunted room in the building. It's said that Anne was locked in this room, and she died in the room as she stared out the window waiting for her mysterious stranger to return. You can actually find the details of this story online. She was locked in there and sat with her knees to her chin, and when she died, her body could not be straightened. Anyway, we entered this room and it was freezing. One of the guests in our group, now I don't know if they were paid actors or not, but one of the guests in our group collapsed and went into a fit, arms and legs flailing everywhere. An ambulance was called, and he was sent to the hospital. Apparently, it happens often that people collapse and have seizures once they enter that room. The house is situated on a cliff, and the sea is in the background. About 4 years ago, we went for a drive down there on a foggy evening, and we were looking out to the sea. As we did, we saw the outline of a ship. It looked like something out of the Pirates of the Caribbean, but it floated through the fog and vanished. There have been hundreds of encounters regarding this house that are recorded. Everyone has their own experiences from visiting, everything from feeling queasy in certain parts of the house, to seeing ghosts in the windows, to meeting people while on tours that nobody else who was on the same tour remembers. There's also a hole in the ceiling that goes through the roof, and this is where the devil flew through to escape from the house. Over the centuries, this hole has been repaired multiple times, but each time it is repaired, it will only last for a few days and then reopens again in the same place.
I grew up in a historical town in the UK where there is a cathedral that's over 700 years old. For hundreds of years, people across England and beyond would pilgrimage to it. My family bought a house in this town and decided to renovate it. From the start, I had edgy feelings about the place, but being a generally nervous teen at the time, I put it down to me just being silly. My dad is a total no bullshit kind of guy. Calls a spade, has no time for the paranormal, spiritual, or religious chat. He thinks in terms of logic and realism and trusts what he can see and touch. My mom and him have had some heated debates about the fact that she has seen or felt unexplained things, and he scoffs at that. Basically, if anything spooky ever happened to him, I would believe it purely because he doesn't. I found this out years later. One night, Dad was woken up by the sound of hooves galloping. We slept on the ground floor, but nowhere near cattle or horses, so the unusual noise woke him up. He got up and left the bedroom to look for the source of the sound. He took one step toward the lounge door in front of him and opened it. The lounge door had windows that opened out onto the main road. Through the window, all he could see were rows and rows of heads walking past the house. The heads had gold helmets with red plumage on them, and they all moved toward the center of town, toward the cathedral. They didn't pay attention to him, but just moved silently through, just their heads facing toward town. We knew the road that we lived on was built on a Roman road, and he believed that these were Roman soldiers on horseback making their way to the city. Over the years, the land would have been built on and up an accumulated height. So in this day and age, all that you could see of them was their neck and head.
Back in the early 80s, my then boyfriend moved into an apartment in Brockport, New York to be closer to his college. It was a nice 2-bedroom. The building was about 5 years old. It overlooked the parking lot of some plazas with a burger monarch that he worked part-time at. Every night, from the time we moved in until I moved out, I had one of 3 creepy dreams. One involved being back at my parents' house, where the stairs up to the attic are in my closet, and either an infestation of snakes or something oozy and rotting was sort of slurping its way to the stairs to make its way down. The second dream was of being lost and unable to find the apartment building. The big kicker dream involved it being moving day, and as I walked around trying to decide where to hang the spice shelf, I noticed black and red writing and smears on the walls. I remember thinking to myself in the dream that they should have been painted over. The night before I moved out, the dream continued with me being in my bedroom, and there was a guy in a hooded robe standing and leaning against the doorframe watching me. I woke up when Keith got home from his work shift, and he asked me why I didn't wave back. See, he had one of those great hooded velour bathrobes, and he had waved at a hooded figure in our bedroom window thinking that I had gotten up to watch for him coming home. I wasn't standing there, and wasn't even awake. When we were moving out, him back to the dorm and me to a different branch of my company, we found a little medallion with some of the glyphs that I had seen on the wall in my dreams. Luckily, who or whatever it was didn't follow me, and a friend warded the heck out of my new bedroom. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. A good buddy of mine, Andy, and I went for a hike around our local quarry. We took a trail that we hadn't taken before. It had really awesome lookouts and a crazy graveyard that we walked by. It was super cool. We also hiked around to this other awesome spot with big rocks to climb. Then we decided to head back to the car. As we were walking back, Andy said that he felt like he had just walked through a giant spider web on the trail, but he couldn't see or feel any strands to pull off. I said, "You just went through a portal," jokingly. He said, also half-jokingly, that he felt like he might have. Then he said that he started feeling a weird static electricity. This was strange because I was feeling the exact same thing. We were walking, and seriously, it felt strangely just intense with jolts of energy going through both of our bodies. Our plan was to take a break at this cool wooden deck down by the quarry water. It was about halfway back to the end of the trail. The plan was originally to chill there for a minute and listen to music on the water, but after that happened we were freaking out and wanting to see if we could feel that same electricity again, so we went back the way we came and actually took another way back to the trail. We didn't feel anything this time. We had walked just far enough to kind of dismiss what had happened, but then we got back to the same spot where it had happened before. As soon as we started walking up the trail, all of a sudden it was like everything got so quiet, and it felt like we had walked into a cloud of energy that was even stronger than before. There was even an audible buzzing sound in our ears. It seriously made both of us stop in our tracks and say, "It's happening again." But this time, it was not a very good feeling. Like, I've never had a feeling of, "do not go that way," that intense before. We turned right around and walked the heck out of there, spooked as hell. This is a real story in this area. People actually report seeing this. It's a tale that comes from a little town in Lancaster County, a place called Elizabethtown. It's called the Purple Light Bridge, and it's a story that began in the early 1900s. Could be more than a tale, though, since there is proof of the purple light and the tragic incident behind it. So one of the tales is that a young boy is struck by a train on the bridge that intersects between Turnpike and Road Street, which is where the train station for Amtrak is. It supposedly happened in 1934, and some people claim that there is proof of the accident. So after the boy's death, it is said that late at night you can see a purple light on the bridge or in the gorge where the train track ran into from the north heading southwest. People like to argue that you can see the light at another location, and that it's been there not only by the train station itself. They claim that you can see the lights under the bridge that is above the train tracks on Bossler Road. Bossler Road, for this purple light, had another tale. A mother brought her son to the bridge, and under that bridge, she hung her son, and then herself. Locals say that the purple light that you see is the mother and the son, as one energy. Some people have claimed that the purple light comes from the moonlight reflecting off of the rocks below. Yet even more people claim that it's actually the bridge a couple miles away in Newville near Elizabethtown. I have not yet tried to investigate, but certainly intend to. This is a series of events that occurred when I lived on a plot of farmland a couple of years ago. I was pregnant with my daughter, and my boyfriend worked late at night, so I was home alone a lot. Things were okay for a while, but as time went on, it started feeling strange in the house. I always felt like I was being watched while in my bathroom and the hallway right by it. I started feeling uncomfortable around windows at night. I figured I was just scared of being there alone. One of the first strange events happened while my boyfriend and I were in bed. While watching TV, I saw the door handle to our room slowly turn as if someone were about to open the door, but then it turned back. It caught me off guard, and I was trying to get my boyfriend's attention, but it stopped when he finally looked. Things began falling off the surfaces outside where my boyfriend would go to smoke cigarettes. He told me he would feel breathing on his face while in bed. He told me several months after it started happening, thinking that it would freak me out if he told me. He's not the type to jump to it's a ghost conclusion. After I had my daughter, I was even more scared to be in the house by myself. I even began locking myself in our room every single night. One night, I was waiting for him to come home from work. It was around 3 a.m. I heard the door handle jiggle as if someone were about to come in, but then stopped. I figured my boyfriend had to use the bathroom or something. After waiting for about 10 minutes, I called him asking why he didn't come in yet, and he told me that he wasn't even home. My friend came over to hang out with me and my daughter. I was changing her while my friend was in the other room. I heard someone say, "Hello?" And I thought it was my friend, but she said she heard it too, and that it wasn't her. I would get my friend to come pick me and my daughter up frequently when my boyfriend was at work because I was so afraid. One night, I had an overwhelming feeling of danger and had them come get us. I was taking my daughter's car seat out to their car, and it literally felt like someone yanked it down and out of my hands. I didn't drop it. I don't know how to explain it other than to say just that it was yanked or jerked down. I hated being in this house. I can't even explain the feelings that I felt all the time. I was just so terrified, and I'm so happy to be out of there. We moved away 3 years ago. On moving day, my boyfriend told me there were garbage bags at the top of the stairs that were placed in a way that they weren't going to go anywhere. But as he and his brother were loading up the last bit of stuff out the front door, he saw these bags come tumbling from down the stairs. My bland storytelling does my emotions no justice. I've never been so scared just to be in my own house every night. As soon as the sun would set, the whole vibe would shift. I thought I was crazy. I was getting angry and upset far too often over nothing. I honestly dread the idea of ever going through something like that again.
This is a story my grandma and grandpa told me a while back. I'm originally from a small town in Pennsylvania, and my grandfather was a state trooper for a majority of the time that he lived there before retirement. He took a course on hazardous waste removal. I can't remember his reasoning, but he was trained to be a guy in a hazmat suit who took toxic or irradiated waste away from certain locations. One night, while he and my Nana were asleep, he violently jolted straight up to a sitting position in his bed, still asleep. He pointed to a chair in the corner of his room and said to my Grams, who had been awoken by his movement, "Mary Lou, he's sitting right there in the chair. Do you see him?" My Nana was freaked out, so she tried to get him to lay back down in the bed, which took a few minutes, but eventually he was back to sleeping soundly. In the morning, my pop said that he saw Death sitting in the chair in his room staring at him, and he took that as an omen that he was going to die very soon. About 2 months later, an incident at 3 Mile Island occurred, and the police force out there asked my pop's station to send all of his people there who had hazardous waste training to help get it cleaned up. My pop decided to take 2 weeks off and take a trip to Mexico with my mom and uncle because of the dream that he had had. And when he got back, many of the people that he had known at his office had some kind of radiation poisoning that eventually killed them. I don't tell it as well as they do, but I thought it was an interesting story. "10 years ago, I was a stupid 18-year-old kid who was living with his parents in Flagstaff, Arizona. We moved almost every 3 years due to the nature of my dad's work, so I got to see most of the country. It was a Tuesday in November. My mom said that we were packing up the apartment and moving to Seattle for what was going to be another year and 2 months. I had a small 300cc motorcycle at the time. I think it was a V-Star, but I could be wrong. And decided to hook up a GPS and use the time to go on a ride across the West Coast. My mother didn't like the idea, but I knew that I would be safe due to personal experience and knowing when and when not to ride. Besides, it would be a 3-day trip and I would get to see all sorts of neat stuff along the way. I notified my job that I was going to transfer, threw on my saddlebags, and a day later was on the road. I made it all the way through western Nevada in order to avoid LA traffic, and stopped prior to taking the I-5 into California. That evening I stayed in a Days Inn hotel. After breakfast and a talk with the locals, I crossed through Reno into western Cali. From there, it was only 4 more hours until I reached Oregon. Luckily, I had time to spare, so I wanted to take some back roads and discover what this dank, damp state had to offer. It was fall, and there was a deep chill in the air. Riding through it sent shivers down my spine like nothing else. November's weather in Oregon is almost identical to that of Pittsburgh during that season. It makes you want to curl up into a ball and sleep for a decade, only to wake up and repeat the process all over again. Eventually, I got tired enough that I wanted to find somewhere to stay, and managed to see a sign advertising a Green Hills hunting lodge on the side of the road. It was accompanied by a long, steep hill that took me what felt like an hour to climb. Then, when I reached the top, I was greeted by a large and gorgeous cabin that looked like it was specifically made for weddings, like something ripped out of a fairy tale. Bewildered, I parked my bike, took off my bags, and threw a tarp over it, which was secured to bungee cords. I walked inside and met a Korean woman who was working the front desk. She spoke perfect English, but had a very distinct accent in which she explained to me that I could choose my room due to an abundance of vacancy. Cool, right? I chose room 31, as the entire building was all on one floor that evening. She handed me a key with the tag 31 attached via a keyring and tells me to have a good night. I throw all my stuff down and head to the bathroom to wash up after riding for an entire day. The room itself looks like a cabin and is absolutely gorgeous. The floorboards were all real wood, and even the shower had the same natural wood as the tub surrounding it. I take a shower and then head to bed, and realize that the mattress is incredibly comfortable and make myself cozy, only to realize that something is off. It's not something obvious, but I knew that there was some sort of oddity about this place. I push it to the back of my mind and fall asleep. The next morning, I wake up to find that the walls went from a natural brown to a deeper gray, as if they were stained overnight. This wasn't a result of natural lighting versus LED. The room was without a doubt a different color. I shrug it off and get all my stuff together, making sure that everything is still where I left it. I head out of the room to find that not only had the walls changed color, I was on a second floor that previously didn't exist. The light from the morning sun wasn't permeating the windows of the cabin, and there was no one in sight. I started to freak out, nearly having a panic attack because this wasn't right. Thankfully, there were stairs that I dashed down as fast as I could and made my way to the front desk and rang the bell once, twice, 3 times. I was breathing heavy and knew that I had to get out of there. No one was coming to check up on me after about 10 minutes of waiting, so I dashed out of the doors and into the lot. I ripped the tarp off of my bike and looked back at the lodge. It wasn't the same. This was a broken down, abandoned, dirty building that looked as though it was about to be condemned. I didn't want to ask any more questions, and rode off as fast as I could. That place still haunts me, even to this day.
This happened last night. I am currently car camping. I woke up last night for a whiz, and while I was doing my thing, I could see a floating, irregularly shaped light off to my left, about 2 meters, 6 feet, away. I didn't feel scared, more of a what is that kind of feeling. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this, so please bear with me. Its appearance was kind of like a parallelogram, except the short edges were jagged and ripped into 2 long appendages. It was kind of a milky white in color, with no light emanating from it. It floated in a straight line and came to a tree where it did 3 little hops and then disappeared around the tree. I finished my business, but didn't have my phone. I did have a flashlight, so thinking it was someone in the trees, I shone the beam through the trees, but nothing reflected back. I turn around to go back and get in the car, and the light thing is dancing around the back of my car, right beside me. I was able to walk up to it and try to touch it. I say try because my hand just touched the car. But the even weirder thing was that when I touched it, my hand created a shadow over the top of it. It was like it had no feeling at all, like just going through air. After it floated around the car, it disappeared around the side, and I lost sight of it altogether. I climbed back in the car for sleep, but was incredibly baffled, and prepped my phone just in case that thing floated through the window. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working.
My birthday was on April 14th and I had just turned 12, so there were multiple balloons on the floor where this happened. It was around 3:30 a.m. on Sunday, and my family was asleep, but I was playing with my new birthday present, a Nintendo Switch, in my bedroom. I heard a loud pop sound coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a balloon, but louder and sort of more aggressive, if that makes sense. I put down my Nintendo Switch and told the girl that I was playing with that I would be right back. I opened my bedroom door and headed to the living room to explore the cause of this noise. I saw a deflated balloon in the same spot where it was earlier. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a misty white apparition in the shape of a woman, maybe about 4 feet tall, seated on my dad's sheepskin chair. I felt extremely cold, and an inexplicable feeling washed over me. The best way I can describe it is an overwhelming feeling of dread. I really wanted to go back to the safety of my own room, so I turned around and went back inside. I was playing with my friend and it was around 4:15 a.m. when I heard another noise coming from the living room. It was the sort of sound that you hear when something falls on glass but doesn't break it. Being scared as hell, I decided not to explore, as the sun was rising and I was getting ready for online school, and I go to the living room and the second noise happened. I see a framed picture lying face down on the ground. The picture is of my grandma who died in 2009, holding me as a baby. My grandpa was always a big hunter. It's not uncommon here in the Midwest. He would always find new areas to hunt and get permission to hunt on private properties. So one day, him and his buddy got permission to go on this private land that I believe was around 100 acres total. I don't recall the specifics of exactly where the forest was. For now, I know for a fact that this was in the Michigan-Indiana border area, or in other words, Michiana. Anyways, they set out around noon to get to the forest and arrived at around 1 p.m. and started hiking back into the woods. They each had their own tree stands or blinds set up prior, so they made their way to them. I remember my grandpa telling me that they hiked a few miles back, so they had to have been deep in the woods. As the day goes on, they don't see any deer, so once the sun began to set, they decided to start making their way back to the truck and met up near my grandpa's tree stand. This is where the weird stuff happens. They're making their way back and the sun has completely set. Luckily, they brought flashlights for the walk back because otherwise they would have had to have walked a few miles in pitch black. Anyways, they finally have about a mile of hiking left when they see something or someone crouched in front of them with their back turned to them. My grandpa described him as a bald white guy wearing a black and white striped shirt. My grandpa's friend speaks up after a moment that I can only imagine as a "what the heck is this feeling?" and asks what he's doing out there, and without a word, the man stands up and faces them, stares, then levitates up toward the trees, and disappears. After that, they sprinted to the truck and never went back to that land again. I know it's not the craziest of stories, and sounds so weird, but I know for a fact that my grandpa did experience this. My grandpa's not a liar, and it was never some scary campfire story that he told us grandkids. When he told me, I could see in his face that it was disturbing him, and is something that he can never forget. I live in South Africa with my family, and we recently moved into a 2-story house. My room is upstairs. Simple room, really, bed facing the sliding door. Just outside the sliding door, I have a small area where I can smoke. To my left, we have a view of our indoor pool, with an almost UV light type of effect. Now, to my problem. It's been 2 weeks in this new place, and something is following me. I know I sound crazy, but it breathes very, very hard. Last night I went to bed at around 11 p.m. after watching some memes on YouTube. I woke up with a rather foul smell. I honestly assumed I had farted in my sleep. But as soon as I stood up to open the sliding door, I felt it. I swear I am not crazy. I felt something breathing down my neck, and the smell got worse. This story comes from my girlfriend, who told me that a couple of months ago her mom was exiting an office that she works at in the middle of the night when she saw an apparition. She described it as looking like a very abnormally large black dog that was staring her down in the parking lot. Apparently the dog charged at her and vanished as it went through her, never to be seen again after that. Now, my girlfriend's mom is no stranger to the paranormal, and has tons of crazy stories, and this being the latest incident, she knew it meant something bad. She called my girlfriend frantically, asking her to check on her grandpa, who they were taking care of for about a year at that point, but he was okay. 2 days later, however, he passed on. This also happened to my girlfriend's grandma on her mom's side, where she was outside and saw a large, black dog on the roof of her house staring her down until it jumped down and vanished into her as well.
Her first husband died after she received this visit from the dog. From what I could take from the story, it seemed more immediate than just 2 days. It was the first I've ever heard of a large black dog figure appearing, and a few hours later my curiosity led me to searching for similar experiences online. I stumbled across mythology and folklore, speaking of how large black dogs and/or hellhounds are omens of death. Before we begin, you must understand that everything you are about to read is absolutely true, and the events continue to this day. It was last summer. My girlfriend, now wife, and I finally made the big decision to move in together. Cobblestone Square is a situation of apartment complexes surrounding a central park. After living in another apartment for 2 years, I learned that a bigger apartment was opening up on the other side of the complex. We needed more space because my wife had 2 children from a previous marriage. After a rushed inspection, we were happy to move in right at the start of June. The months passed by, and the days grew shorter and colder. Autumn was drawing to a close, and with it, that's when the trouble began. In all the stories and movies, it starts out small. Things moving from place to place, lights being left on, etc., all chalked up to forgetfulness. This was true in our case, and we didn't think much of it. It only started to escalate with the children. Our apartment is set up with 2 bedrooms and bathrooms on opposite ends from each other. In our bedroom, we have our own private bathroom, and next to the kids' room is a small hallway leading to their own bathroom. We would give them baths in there and potty train, and almost as if flicking a switch, when the autumn months came, our youngest, a 2-year-old girl, would absolutely hate going in that bathroom. At the mere mention of bath time, she would go into hysterics, or on good days, she would sit in the tub, and in the process of bathing, she would look past myself or my wife and start screaming and crying. Oftentimes something would catch her eye in the mirror, and she would also start crying like mad. The most unsettling part would be that as soon as we took her out of the bathroom, she would stop and act as if nothing had happened. Our son, who was 4 at the time, would also run up to us and say that he would hear a voice saying, "Uppy," which was a common saying among the children when they wanted to be held. We asked if it was his sister, and he would profusely say that it wasn't, but he said it sounded like a kid. This happened a few times. With my wife being separated from her first husband and splitting custody, we would have the children come live with us every other week. On the weeks that the kids would go stay with their dad, the activity would seem to die down, but that didn't mean that it wouldn't happen at all. I asked my wife what she remembered from last year, and she recounted a time when we didn't have the children and she was cleaning the house. She noticed the kids' door was open. We usually keep it closed, but she thought maybe I had went into their room for something. She checked to see if I was inside, and seeing that I wasn't, she closed the door and didn't really think anything of it. It wasn't until a while later that she went to use the kids' bathroom and saw that the door was open again. She found me in our room and asked if I had opened it, and I said that I hadn't. With more incidents of lights being found on and doors opening, it all came to a head near the end of October when I was washing dishes in the kitchen. Above the sink, facing the living room, is a small window that allows someone in the kitchen to look out into the dining room and the living room, and additionally the back door, which is a sliding glass door. Important detail. After the kids had been put to bed and were asleep, my wife and I went about our normal duties and chores, trying to finish up before the next day started. As I was washing dishes, I looked up from the sink and saw in the glass of the sliding glass door the reflection of a large shadow in the hallway to the kids' bedroom. It quickly entered the bathroom, and I immediately walked over, turning on the light, and seeing nothing there. I went to my bedroom where my wife was vacuuming, and I asked her if she by chance went into the kids' bathroom for whatever reason. I wasn't surprised by her response when she said no, and I told her what I had seen. It was after this event, and subsequently Halloween, that all the activity seemed to stop. More months passed by again, and we jumped to 2020. August. As soon as the activity started again, I began to keep a journal of all the findings. That way there was a record. On August 10th, I went to the bathroom, the kids' bathroom, before going to bed, and heard a small child giggle. Both children were fast asleep. On August 11th, my wife was bathing our daughter, and for the first time in a year, our little girl started to shriek in fear until she was out of the bathroom. On August 13th, while getting ready for bed, our son knocked on our door. I'm always the one to answer, and he told me that he was afraid. He wouldn't elaborate on why, but when I laid him down in his bed, he begged for the closet to be closed. The closet has never been a problem, and a few nights after this we returned to it being opened and haven't experienced anything like it again. On August 15th, my wife and I had an argument, and I went out to the couch to sleep for the night. As I was tossing and turning, I heard a child's voice in the night say, "Uh-huh," as if answering a question. I didn't react, and forced myself to go back to sleep. Both myself and my wife have caught our son speaking to himself as well. My wife told me that once she heard him saying, "Ow, stop it, you're hurting me." And when she went to go check on him, he was in the hallway by the kids' bathroom, holding his arm. During the daytime, the kids were playing, and both me and my wife were doing our own thing. As I was sitting on the couch, our son runs behind the couch and stops, and then says, "And how would you do that?" out of the blue. I turn to him and ask him who he's talking to, and after a moment's hesitation, he says, "Nobody." I told him I heard him say something, and he then insisted that he didn't say anything. On one occasion, my wife was sleeping on the couch, and in the middle of the night heard a man's whisper say, "Don't get up," to which she promptly obeyed. It was the night after that I woke up from my sleep in bed to see a shadow shape standing over me with piercing red eyes. I felt as if it was going to hurt me. My wife and I have naturally begun our interest in the spiritual world. We began researching and looking for ways to go about this. We've purchased a Ouija board with no results, and from a medium, a supposedly haunted ring. If our apartment was going to be haunted, we wanted to know by who and with what intention. It seems as if our mail-order ghost has already made their home, as one morning our front door was unlocked and slightly ajar, with nothing stolen. Tonight, as I write this, my wife and I were watching TV on the couch and decided to call it an evening. But as we got to our bedroom, I noticed a low scratching sound coming from the record player. I opened it up and saw that the turntable was moving as the needle was off its holder, turning the record player on. I replaced the needle and tried knocking the player a few times to see if it could have been easily bumped or knocked off, but no. The only way to move that needle was to pick it up with your fingers and set it down. I was reminded of one other time that this happened, long before we bought any haunted items. I am thoroughly convinced that my apartment is haunted. People die in them way too often to think it's not a possibility, and if nobody died here, the cemetery across the road definitely doesn't bring me any comfort. I can say that two distinct entities can be somewhat accounted for, a small child ghost and something else. Or maybe something that wants to be viewed as a child, but let's think happy thoughts. We still live here to this day. Autumn is just beginning, and that's when things really seem to get interesting.
I finally talked my friend into moving from Seattle to Texas. We decided to split the move into 2 parts, the first one last week, moving her stuff in a rented SUV. We both had some time, and we decided to take the trip on all the back roads. We stayed at a mineral springs resort in the middle of nowhere in Oregon that was amazing. On the second day, we got up to drive to Vegas. We took US 50, which is known as the loneliest highway in America. I will admit that before this, it had been 8 to 10 hours before we had had any human contact. I am a former over-the-road trucker and a US veteran, so I'm used to traveling to different places and being in new surroundings every day, but it also taught me to listen to my instincts. Let me tell you, did they come in loud and clear while on this trip a few hours away from Vegas we stopped to get gas. As we rolled into the place, I just thought it looked aged, very dated. My friend decided to get gas. I walked inside to look at the place and get some snacks. I can honestly say that I can't point to any one thing that was wrong, but the feeling that overcame me was indescribable. It basically told me that the place was, well, the phrase that I would use is out of place, and that I needed to go right then. Now, I'll admit that this could be my own experience, and maybe because I had such a bad feeling that I was imagining things, but the minute I decided to leave, without buying anything or even using the restroom, I swear everybody in the place started looking at me. And I don't mean just the employees, but the patrons. I walked quickly to my car and told my friend that if she believed in instincts, that we should just get in the car and leave right that second. We did, and we did not breathe easy until we were about 10 miles away. That was my spooky encounter in the middle of Death Valley. My dad and I decided to go to this store one day to buy incense, and we meet this woman that I think owns the shop, and she's weirdly interested in the color of my eyes. My eyes are a weird color, they're yellow and green, but she was telling me that they're so bright that they're deceiving. Well, fast forward to a few weeks later, and I'm in my room asleep. My mom is awake, and when I woke up, she told me that she saw a woman, perfectly described her as the woman from that shop, astral projecting into our house, and went in my room and tried to take me. My mom had never went to that store, had never seen that woman, so that's how I know she wasn't lying. My mom and dad weren't on talking terms at that time. But ever since then, I get really weird nightmares involving her in them, and they occur every night, and I can't get them to stop. They always involve her taking me. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I don't exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come and fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along, and told us we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there, and I had been in charge of reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips. We drove back home a few days later after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was very long. For whole stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers knocked out almost immediately. So most of the trip, it was just my dad and I talking or listening to music. I'm also a very avid reader, so I had a book on my lap beside the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad only let me turn on the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service, and the Game Boy's batteries had all died. All I had left to do was look outside. All of a sudden, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I recognized that there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, bowler or top hat, dancing and jumping from roof to roof of this suburban lot. It was kind of like the scene from Singing in the Rain, which at that point I had not seen yet. It took a second to realize that it wasn't a normal thing to just happen. The houses were separated in a way where a normal person couldn't possibly have jumped roof to roof. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I couldn't see it, I could sense him smiling. All I felt was dread. I turned to face my dad to see if he had seen him as well, but he had been paying attention to the road. When I turned back, I couldn't see the houses anymore. They were way behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember feeling afraid that he might follow us, or that he could if he wanted to. I never saw something like that on our many road trips ever again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, but it felt so real. The memory is very vivid as well, which always comes back when I'm watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way that he moved.
My partner and I had just become parents, and were looking for our first home. We found an older house built around 1910-1920, which seemed perfect. It was next to a good school and close enough to family that could help out with our daughter. Everything seemed great for the next couple of years, but there was always a heavy type of atmosphere that was hard to explain. And we had this feeling like we were being watched all the time. My wife was the first to notice it, and I would always brush it off as if there was nothing to be scared of. I always carried that mindset, as I was highly skeptical of any type of paranormal activity, and I always trusted the whole "if you can't see it, then it doesn't exist" paradigm. How wrong I was, it turned out. The initial signs were that things would go missing and then suddenly turn up in the most peculiar of places, like photos, and my watch, which ended up in the bathtub. But most of the time, things seemed to find their way into the wardrobe that was in the master bedroom. Once my daughter woke us up in the night to tell me that someone had just walked out of her window. As she grew up, she would complain that the man was in her room and she couldn't sleep. I was still not believing that this could be a ghost, so I would comfort her and stay with her until she went back to sleep, and I watched a black-like shadow thing, which I can only describe as darker than the shadows around it, move from the corner of the room and out of the window. I went back downstairs and sat on the sofa, where the deepest growl I ever heard happened, which completely took me by surprise as it sounded as if it was right behind my ear. I nearly jumped out of my skin and thought I needed a drink. I went to the kitchen and I could hear laughter in the living room. I couldn't think of any logical reason for it, so I went back upstairs and sat in my daughter's room again for the rest of the night, but nothing more happened. Eventually, things escalated to the point where every night around 2 a.m., you would hear walking up and down the stairs so loud that we nicknamed whatever it was Mr. Boots. When my daughter was around 10, we would get massive bangs in the middle of the night. When it first happened, I honestly thought we were being burgled. I would run down the stairs only to find nothing, not a thing out of place. I had the plumbing checked and electrical, but all was good. Then, one night, I fell asleep downstairs, and an inflatable hammer flew at the TV, instantly waking me with the noise because it had a squeaker in it. I again was trying to work out how that had happened, and whilst I was thinking about it and looking at the hammer on the floor, it started spinning really slowly. I jumped up and walked to the kitchen, and again I heard the laughter. I then heard the boots on the stairs, and my wife suddenly comes down the stairs, woken by a really bad nightmare. While we were both talking in the kitchen, we heard the laughter again. Not long after this, we couldn't take it anymore and left. But I have hundreds of weird encounters, and I can honestly say that this house turned me into a believer. I always wondered what it was that was in that house. Ghost, demon. We still talk about that place now and then. And probably always will. "25 years ago, we moved homes. It wasn't in the greatest of areas, but it was better than we were previously. I shared a room with one of my 4 sisters. We had a TV in our room, but the remote control was broken, so we never used it. It stayed on Channel 5, the TV Guide channel. After a few months of living there, the TV in our room would randomly turn on every night and switch to Channel 33, which was usually Seventh Heaven or Full House that would be playing. No one in my family ever watched that channel. We didn't think anything paranormal about it. The house didn't feel creepy. Everything was fine aside from the TV turning on. Eventually, the channel would change to a station with just static, and the volume would turn on all the way. It would scare us and wake us up every night, so we unplugged the TV. Ever since the station had changed to static, the vibe of the house felt different. It was heavy, and my sisters and I always felt afraid, but we didn't know why. After a year living there, we would experience weird things. Lights turning off and on, random noises, hearing kids. Our aunt lived downstairs, and she was always keeping her room locked, even when she was home. One day my sister and I went downstairs to grab the vacuum, and we heard jumping on my aunt's bed, and her door was wide open. My aunt was at work, so we poked our heads in to see who was there. We saw no one, but heard kids laughing and the bed moving, once again as if someone were jumping up and down on it. A few days later, we were playing in the living room upstairs and we heard a cough coming from down the hall. We went to check on who it was, because no one was home aside from my sisters and I, and we were all together. We saw a man in black pointing to my sister's room as if he wanted us to go. We were terrified, so of course we didn't. We stayed put until my parents came home. When they arrived, we told them what happened. They went to check out my sister's room, and there were scratches and crayon marks all over the wall and ceiling. We ended up moving out of the house when my aunt was sleeping with her door locked, and in the middle of her sleep, she heard the voices of 3 different men. When she tried to open her eyes, they were held shut. They choked her and laughed. She tried to scream for help, but she couldn't make a sound. She eventually passed out, and when she woke up, she felt as though she had been beaten. Her door was still locked, and everything was still in place. We thought it was sleep paralysis, as there were no signs of anything that happened. But later on that day, and within the next few days, there were bruises all over her body and around her neck. We couldn't explain what had occurred.
I'm 23 years old and starting to remember this shadowy figure that would appear then disappear in my old family's house. One second there would be nothing, then the next instant he would be right beside you. He didn't have a set place in the house. He would always move and walk around the house, and you'd know it was him because you would get this feeling that you weren't alone. He'd be walking beside you or on top of the staircase, just watching. I have to add that he never felt evil. He was definitely not an angry spirit, more like a watcher. I also want to add that I describe him like a man because I remember him being very tall and his silhouette was a masculine shape. Other than that, you couldn't make out his face or anything else. He seemed like he may have been cloaked or hooded sometimes, though. He never did much, just came and left. Everyone, except my younger sister because she was too young, knew about the Shadow Man, but once he appeared to someone who was alone. I should mention that before I was born in 1997, that my great-grandmother on my dad's side had died of old age in the house. She had passed away in the back bedroom, which became me and my brother's room when my younger sister was born. My dad was with her on that night, and says that she saw something. He walked out of the room and came back, and she was dead. Anyways, my parents got married and we moved in 2012, and I haven't seen the Shadow Man since. Whenever I think about it though, or hear similar stuff, all the hair on my body stands up, and my right eye drops a single tear, every time, without fail. It's even happening as I type. I try to control it, but I can't. I've had other supernatural encounters, and this always happens.
I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by, the door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. This is a true story. When I was in high school, I had a friend who lived near our house. We would always walk from school to our homes. We were pretty close, and we talked about anything. One time, when we were walking along the road, she suddenly spoke and said that she smelled candles. It was a busy street, and it was only around 4 p.m., I think. I replied, "It must be from the truck." I said this because one had just driven past us when she said that. She had a serious face, which was unusual because she was more talkative between the two of us. She insisted that she could still smell it as we continued walking, but stopped after a while. Fast forward to the next day. It was Saturday and I had just woken up. I literally got goosebumps. I felt so shocked when I read her text. It said that her father had died. Do you also believe in superstitions? Here in our country, a smell of flower or candle indicates the death of a person. About 4 years ago, I took my dog for a short hike. It was about a mile walk from the car to the beach along the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington state. The trail led us through the tall cedar trees, and then to a large clearing which led to the beach. My dog and I played on the beach for a while before I decided to head back. We stopped and took a break at a picnic table in the middle of the clearing. My dog, being the monkey she is, was standing on top of the picnic table looking around when she fixated on a spot across the field and her hair rose on the back of her neck. Always one to trust my pup, I became extra observant. As we stood there, a black mist appeared out of thin air to our right. I watched as it took on a long form roughly the size of a human. It glided across the trail and dissolved. It was really like looking at a small black translucent cloud. It scared the crap out of me and my dog, and I boogied back to the car. I've never found an answer to what the black mist was. When I was a kid, I was with my family on a road trip a few hours away. We were driving down through a winding canyon, and it was dark. I was looking out my window, just staring at the dirt walls that we were passing. It was like the inside of cliffs on one side and forest on the other. Well, I was on the side of the car with the dirt hills and the cliff walls, and as we turned to go around a bend, I saw something human-shaped, which looked like it had a long, white face that resembled the Scream mask, hanging on the hillside. It happened so fast that it scared me to death nearly. I never said anything. I think it was because I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but I really don't think that it was a human being. This vivid memory is still clear as day. I've been working at a funeral home for about a year as an assistant, and will be starting up my apprenticeship next month. I have had several weird encounters since working there, but nothing to write about until tonight. I got back from picking up a decedent around 8:30 p.m. I wheeled them into the prep room, and as I turned around to close the door behind me, I heard a man's voice. The voice either said, "I'm here," or "Come here." I wasn't too freaked out. Weird stuff happens a lot. However, this is the first time that I have actually heard disembodied words. This isn't the most exciting story, but I definitely thought that it was worth sharing.